a cream silk ribbon, a knitted glove no bigger than a man's palm. They survived a war with wands in their hands. Now they face something harder. 2 mothers, 1 week, and a single white candle that will change everything. We begin our story now. The kitchen at Malfoy Manor's East Wing had never been meant for a Malfoy. Hermione had insisted on it the first month they moved in. A real kitchen, copper-bottomed and warm, with a long oak table scarred by previous owners she'd never met and didn't care to. Narcissa had called it quaint, in a tone that suggested the word tasted strange in her mouth. Draco had said nothing. He had only watched his wife run her palm along the wood as though she was settling a horse, and that had been the end of any argument. It was nearly 1 in the morning. Rain moved against the leaded glass in long, patient strokes, the kind of autumn rain that had no urgency about it, that intended to last until dawn. A single candle guttered in a brass holder near the teapot, throwing its soft, unsteady light across the small parchment square that lay between them on the table. The sonogram. Hermione had her hands wrapped around a cup of chamomile that had gone cold an hour ago. She hadn't noticed. She was looking at the parchment, and Draco was looking at her, and neither of them had spoken for a long time. 12 weeks, she said finally, very quietly, as though saying it any louder might disturb the rain. 12 weeks, he echoed. His voice was rougher than he meant it to be. He cleared his throat, embarrassed by it, and reached for the teapot. Not because he wanted more tea, but because his hands needed something to do. They had been doing that for days now, finding occupations, polishing the silver edge of a letter opener that did not need polishing, straightening books on his shelf into perfect alphabetical order, then by height, then back again. He had caught himself just that morning refolding the same handkerchief 4 times in succession, and had stopped only when he realized Hermione was watching him from the doorway with an expression he could not entirely read. She slid the sonogram a fraction closer to him with 1 finger. Mother wrote again. Which one? It wasn't quite a question. Both, actually. She gave a small, tired laugh, and her free hand drifted, as it had drifted a dozen times that day, unconsciously, like a compass needle finding north, to the soft flat of her belly. There was nothing to feel yet, nothing visible. But her hand went there anyway, and Draco saw it, and something in his chest did the strange, tightening thing it had been doing since the morning she had pressed the parchment into his palm and said, "Look." "Molly wants to host," she went on. "At the Burrow. She's already knitting, Draco. Both colours. She sent a picture. There are tassels." Tassels. He repeated the word as though testing it for poison. "On the booties. Tiny ones. She says she'll do the cake herself. Lemon, because she remembers I like lemon, which..." And here Hermione's voice caught very faintly, so faintly that anyone else would have missed it. But Draco was not anyone else, and he heard it the way one hears a held breath. "Which my mother also used to make, for my birthdays." He did not say anything to that. He had learned, over 5 years of marriage, that there were moments when speech was a kind of trespass. He only reached across the table, slowly, and laid his hand over hers where it rested on the wood. His thumb moved once, twice, along the silver of her wedding band, and the small bite of the metal against his skin grounded him. Hermione drew in a long breath. Let it out. "And your mother," she said, in a different voice now, the one that meant she was bracing herself, the one she used when entering the ministry on contentious days. "Wants peacocks." "Of course she does. White ones, from a breeder in Switzerland, Draco." "I know. There was a brochure. There was a brochure with a crest on it." "I know. She's commissioned a string quartet. She mentioned marble, Italian marble. For what purpose, I genuinely cannot tell you, because I did not have the strength to ask." He let his head tip back against the wooden ladder of the chair and closed his eyes. The candlelight moved behind his lids in a soft amber wash. From somewhere in the depths of the manor, a clock chimed once, a single low note, like a sigh. "We could refuse," he said, without opening his eyes. "Both of them. We could simply say no. We are grown people. You are a war heroine. I am. Whatever I am, we have the standing. We could. We won't." "No," she said softly. "We won't." He opened his eyes then and looked at her across the candlelight. Her hair was loose, the way it only ever was at this hour, falling in dark gold coils around her shoulders. There were faint violet smudges beneath her eyes. She had not been sleeping well. The nausea was worst in the small hours. And her mouth had that particular set it took on when she was steeling herself for something she did not want to feel. He understood, in that moment, exactly why they would not refuse. And it had nothing to do with peacocks or lemon cake. It had to do with the fact that Hermione's mother would not be at this party. Could not be. The memory charm had held. Her parents lived a quiet life in Australia under a name that was not theirs, and Hermione had decided, after long and terrible deliberation, that to undo it now, after everything, would be a cruelty greater than her own grief. And so Molly Weasley, with her flower-dusted apron and her knitted tassels and her lemon cake, was the closest thing his wife had to a mother in this world. To refuse her, this would be to take something from Hermione that Hermione could not afford to lose. And it had to do with the fact that his own mother, Narcissa, who had stood between him and a Dark Lord with a lie on her lips and her own death in her throat, was reaching, clumsily, expensively, with peacocks and quartets. For a grandchild she had not been certain she would ever be allowed to know. To refuse her would be to undo something fragile that had taken 5 years to grow. He knew all of this without saying any of it. So did Hermione. They had been married long enough that the long speeches lived between them, unspoken in the small movements of hands. "It will be a week," she said. "A week. From the moment we tell them yes until the moment it's over. 1 week of—" She gestured vaguely at the air. "That. Negotiating. Translating. Keeping them from killing each other over fondant." "A week is nothing," he said. "We survived a war. Draco." She gave him a look, fond, exhausted, faintly warning. "Don't." "What?" "Don't say it like that. Don't compare it to the war. You'll jinx us. This will be worse than the war." He almost laughed. He did laugh, actually. A short, startled sound that surprised them both. Hermione's mouth twitched at the corner, and for a moment across the candle and the cold tea and the soft persistence of the rain. They looked at each other the way they sometimes did very late at night, when the rest of the world was elsewhere. Like two people who had stumbled against every prediction and every odds into something genuinely their own. His hand was still over hers. He did not move it. "All right," he said. "We say yes, tomorrow morning, to both of them, and we put on our armor and we go in. Together, together." He turned his palm under hers so that their fingers laced. "And if either of them suggests doves, Granger, I am leaving the country. It's Malfoy. It's Granger when I'm complaining. It's been Malfoy for 5 years. Granger when I'm complaining," he repeated, and there was something so quiet and so settled in the way he said it that she looked down at their joined hands on the wood and did not speak for a long moment. She was thinking, though she would not say it yet, would not say it for several days, that she was very frightened, not of the party, not of Molly's tassels or Narcissa's peacocks. She was frightened of the small bright space behind her ribs that opened a little wider every time she looked at the sonogram. She was frightened of how much she already loved this thing the size of a plum. She was frightened that she did not know how to be a mother, because the only mother she had ever known did not anymore know her. She was frightened too, in a way she had not yet admitted to Draco, of what it would do to him to walk through this week. Because she had seen, last Sunday, the way his jaw had locked when Narcissa, in passing, had mentioned the nursery. She had seen the way he had set down his wineglass too carefully. She had seen the way, later that night, he had stood in the doorway of the spare room, the room that would presumably become the nursery, for a long time without going in. He had a father he did not speak of. He had a childhood he had locked into a small dark box somewhere behind his sternum, and he carried it the way other men carried pocket watches, without remark, but always, always aware of its weight. She was frightened of what this week would press out of him, but she did not say any of this. She only tightened her fingers around his and listened to the rain and watched the candle flame bend in a draught she could not feel. "We should sleep," she said at last. "Yes." Neither of them moved. The candle hissed, found its balance, steadied. Outside, the rain shifted into a slower rhythm. A floorboard somewhere overhead settled with a small wooden sigh, the way old houses speak to themselves in the night. Draco lifted her hand to his mouth and pressed his lips very lightly to the inside of her wrist, to the place where her pulse moved, faint and steady and miraculous, against his lower lip. He held it there for the space of 3 slow breaths. Then he stood and drew her up and blew out the candle. In the sudden dark, with the rain soft on the leaded glass, and the warmth of him at her side, and her hand still curled around his, Hermione closed her eyes and let herself believe, for one selfish moment, that a week of peacocks and tassels was the worst thing that was going to happen to them. She would remember later the exact shape of that belief, the particular shade of its naivety, when the first owl from Narcissa arrived at 7:30 the following morning, bearing a sealed envelope, a length of cream silk ribbon, and a single embossed line in Narcissa's slanting hand. "Darling, we begin." The owl arrived first. It was one of the manor's own, a great pale eagle owl with eyes the precise grey of frost on slate, and it landed on the breakfast sideboard with the dignity of an ambassador. It did not knock things over. It did not ruffle. It extended its leg with the patience of a creature that had been doing this for 100 years and would be doing it for 100 more. Hermione, who was standing at the window in her dressing gown, trying to convince a piece of dry toast to stay in her stomach, looked at the envelope tied to the owl's leg and felt her morning, which had not been promising, take a decisive turn. Draco. Draco, your mother has sent an owl. It is 7:30 in the morning. He was, she observed with a degree of marital exasperation that bordered on affection, still mostly asleep at the table, his head propped on one hand, a teacup steaming forgotten beside his elbow. His hair was uncombed. He was wearing the soft grey dressing gown she had given him 2 Christmases ago and had subsequently regretted because he wore it with such complete and unbothered satisfaction that it had become impossible to be properly cross with him in the mornings. She crossed the kitchen, plucked the envelope from the owl's offered leg, and broke the seal with her thumbnail. The ribbon fell out first. Cream silk, finger width, fluid as water. It pooled on the oak in a small, bright coil. Then the card. Darling, we begin. The florist arrives at 11. Wear something that photographs well. Mother Hermione read it twice. She read it a third time because the contents had not improved with rereading. Then she sat down very carefully in the chair opposite her husband and slid the card across the wood toward him. Draco, without lifting his head from his hand, opened one grey eye, read the card, closed the eye, and said, "No." Draco, "No. It's 11 o'clock. I am aware of the existence of 11 o'clock. I am refusing to participate in it." "You agreed." "I agreed last night. Last night I was tired, and there was candlelight, and you were holding my hand. I was suggestible. I was not in my right mind." "Draco." He opened both eyes at last and looked at her across the toast and the tea and the small, deceptively innocent coil of cream silk. His hair fell into his face. He did not push it back. "Granger," he said, with great gentleness, "if I put on a coat and stand in a room with my mother and a florist before noon, one of us will not survive the experience. I am offering you, in the interest of our marriage, the chance to choose which." "You don't mean that?" "I mean every syllable." She gave him the look. He gave her the other look. They held each other's eyes for the length of time it takes a kettle to begin, very faintly to sing. He sighed. It was a long sigh, drawn from somewhere near his ankles. He sat up. He pushed the hair out of his eyes. He reached for his cold tea and drank it in one swallow with the bleak resignation of a man going to the gallows. "Fine," he said. 11 o'clock. The florist. I will photograph well. Are you happy?" "Enormously." "You are a cruel woman, Hermione Malfoy." "It's Granger when you're complaining." His mouth did the thing it did when he was trying not to smile. The small, reluctant lift at one corner, the slight downward press at the other, as though his face were arguing with itself. He lost the argument. The smile came through anyway, brief and quiet, gone almost before she could be sure she had seen it. The second owl arrived at 7:43. This one was a small, scruffy brown thing, with a feather missing from its tail and an air of slight apology. It bumped into the window twice before finding the open pane, landed in the butter dish, extracted itself with great difficulty, and presented its leg to Hermione with the relieved expression of a creature that had completed a long and arduous journey. The handwriting on this envelope was rounder, warmer, written in a green ink that had blotted slightly at the loops. "Hermione, Love, I've started on the gloves. 3 pair so far in pink and 3 in blue, and I'm doing a little hat in yellow because yellow goes with both, and it's such a cheerful colour, isn't it? Arthur says, "Hello." Ginny says you're to ignore me about the gloves, but I shan't. There's a lemon cake in the oven as I write this. I'll bring a slice when I come tomorrow. About tomorrow, 11 o'clock at the Burrow. Just to talk, love. Nothing fancy. Just so I can fuss over you a little and we can think about what you'd like. I've made a list. All my love, Molly P.S. Arthur wants to know if Draco still drinks his tea the funny way. He's bought a special kind in case. Hermione set the letter down on the oak. She did it very carefully, the way one sets down a glass that is too full. She did not say anything for a moment. The pale eagle owl on the sideboard turned its head and regarded the small brown owl in the butter dish with an expression of profound and ancient disdain. The small brown owl, oblivious, shook a fleck of butter from its wing and looked hopefully at the toast. "Draco," Hermione said. "Yes. They have both scheduled us for 11 o'clock. A long pause. Tomorrow? Today. Another pause. Longer. The pale owl shifted from foot to foot. The small brown owl pecked tentatively at a crumb. The kettle began to whistle in earnest, and somewhere in the high vault of the manor, a clock chimed 7:45 in 3 long, mournful tones. Draco lowered his face slowly into both his hands. "Granger," he said into his palms, "I will give you anything you want. I will give you the manor. I will give you Switzerland. I will give you my left hand. Tell my mother we are dead. Tell Molly Weasley we have eloped to Patagonia. Tell them anything. I am not standing in 2 rooms before noon. You won't have to." He looked up. There was hair in his eyes again. "I'll go to your mother," she said. "You go to Molly." The silence that followed was so complete that the kettle's whistle seemed to enter it like an intruder. Draco said in a voice of dangerous calm, "You want me to go to the Burrow?" "Yes." "Alone?" "Yes." "At 11 o'clock in the morning?" "Yes." "To discuss a gender reveal party with Molly Weasley?" "Yes." "Granger." "It's Malfoy when you're being dramatic." "Granger." He stood up. He crossed to the sideboard. He took the kettle off the heat with a precision that suggested he was containing several emotions in a small space. He poured himself fresh tea with the same precision. He did not look at her. "She will offer me a scone." "Yes." "I will have to eat it." "Yes." "There will be—" He gestured vaguely with a teapot. "Weasleys. Ambient Weasleys. They will be everywhere, like a weather system. Probably only Molly and Arthur on a Tuesday." "Probably." He set the teapot down. He turned. He looked at her at last, and his face had in it that particular expression she'd come to recognize over 5 years, the one that meant he was about to do something he did not want to do, for her, and would never, ever mention it again. "Probably," he said again. "And George. George works from home on Tuesdays. He will be there. He will look at me. He will look at me, Granger, with that face. He likes you. He likes that I irritate his mother. It is not the same thing. You don't irritate her anymore. She's very fond of you. She is fond of me, the way one is fond of a difficult houseplant one has decided not to throw out. It is not the same as ordinary fondness. It has thorns." Hermione got up. She crossed to where he stood at the sideboard, and she took the teacup out of his hand and she set it down, and she put both her palms flat against the soft grey wool of his dressing gown over his ribs, and she felt, beneath her hands, the steady, warm fact of him. "Draco," she said very gently. "She loves me. She has loved me since I was 12 years old, and she didn't know me yet. She will have made you a scone, and she will be nervous because she will want me to be happy, and she will know that I am happy because of you. Go and eat the scone, please." He looked down at her. The morning light from the leaded window fell across one side of his face and left the other in soft shadow, and she could see, in the lit half, the small fan of pale lashes at the corner of his eye, and the faint silver of stubble he had not yet shaved, and a place at the hinge of his jaw where a muscle moved once and then stilled. "You will owe me," he said. "I will owe you enormously. For the rest of our natural lives. For the rest of our natural lives. I want it in writing. Draco. In triplicate, Granger." She rose up onto her toes and she kissed him very lightly at the corner of his mouth, the side where the smile had nearly come earlier and been suppressed. He stood very still for the half second it took, and then his hand came up to the small of her back, and he held her there a moment longer than the kiss required, his forehead bent so that it rested against her temple, his breath warm at her hair. He smelled, as he always smelled in the mornings, of bergamot and clean linen, and something dry and dark beneath, like cedar. She closed her eyes against the soft grey wool of his shoulder, and let herself have 3 breaths of him before she stepped back. 11 o'clock, she said. 11 o'clock, he answered. The pale eagle owl on the sideboard, deciding the matter was settled, lifted its great wings and departed through the window in a single soundless sweep. The small brown owl, less ceremonious, took 2 attempts to get airborne, knocked the butter dish a 1/4 inch to the left, and vanished after it with a small apologetic hoot. The kitchen was suddenly very quiet. Hermione picked up the cream silk ribbon. She wound it slowly around her fingers, once, twice, feeling the cool, slick weight of it, the kind of silk that had cost more per inch than her first month's rent in the small flat she had taken after the war. She thought about Narcissa, who had chosen this ribbon. She thought about Molly, who had written love twice in one letter and underlined it in neither. She thought about the small bright space behind her own ribs, and about the plum-sized fact at the centre of her own body, and about how she did not yet know whether it was a daughter or a son, and how, in some way, she could not name. The answer to that question was not the point at all. The point was that 2 women who had never sat down at the same table in their lives were about to begin trying to plan one party. The point was that she and Draco were going to be the table. She turned. He was watching her from the sideboard, his teacup in his hand again, his expression unreadable in the way it became when he was thinking something he did not intend to share. His eyes went, briefly, to her belly, to the flat, soft place where her dressing gown was tied, and then back up to her face. Whatever he saw there made him set the teacup down. He crossed the kitchen. He took the silk ribbon out of her fingers and laid it on the oak. He took her hands in both of his, and he held them, not romantically, not lightly, but the way one holds the hands of someone one is about to walk into a long, cold building with, the way one says, together, without saying anything at all. 11 o'clock, he said again. 11 o'clock, she answered. And somewhere upstairs, in the great quiet body of the manor, as if in answer, a second owl began to tap, slow and unhurried, against the high glass of the morning-room window. Narcissa Malfoy received her daughter-in-law in the white drawing-room. It was, Hermione thought as she stepped through the tall double doors at 11 a room that had been designed by someone who had never been cold a day in their life. Everything in it was pale silk on the walls, in a watered pattern that caught the light like moving frost, pale rugs underfoot so deep her shoes sank into them, pale roses in tall crystal vases on every surface, their scent so heavy in the still air it sat on the tongue. A fire burned in the white marble hearth, but it burned without sound, the way manor fires did, and the heat it gave off was strangely impersonal, as if it had been summoned by appointment. Narcissa stood at the window with her back to the door. She was dressed in dove grey, a high-collared morning robe with seed pearls at the cuffs, and her pale hair was drawn back in the smooth coil she always wore before noon. She did not turn when Hermione entered. She did not need to. Hermione had learned over 5 years of these encounters that Narcissa always knew exactly when she had been joined in a room, and that the choice not to turn immediately was itself a kind of communication. "Hermione, dear." "Narcissa. You're punctual. I do appreciate that." "You said 11. And yet so few people take 11 to mean 11. She turned at last, and her face, in the cool window light, was as composed as a portrait. Only her eyes moved, flicked once, very quickly, down Hermione's body and up again, the briefest professional assessment, gone almost before it had registered. "You're wearing the green. Good. The florist will respond to the green. He's a man who responds to colour, you understand. He cannot help it. It's almost a medical condition." "Narcissa." "Sit, darling, sit. He'll be up in a moment. Marlowe is bringing him through the long gallery, so he has time to be impressed. It softens them." She crossed to the small inlaid table where a silver tea service waited and began, with the ritual precision of a woman who had poured tea at this exact table for 30 years to fill 2 cups. "Sugar?" "No, thank you." "Of course. I do remember. I only ask because it's polite." Hermione sat. The pale silk chair was harder than it looked. She arranged her hands in her lap and made them stay there, because if she did not make them stay there, they would migrate, as they had been migrating all morning, to the soft flat of her belly. And Narcissa was not a woman in whose presence one performed unconscious gestures. "Draco's not joining us," Narcissa observed, without inflection, holding out a cup. "He had another engagement." It was the most expressive Hermione had ever heard. It contained, in 2 letters, the suggestion that Narcissa knew precisely where her son was, knew precisely whose kitchen he was sitting in, knew precisely which Weasley was at this moment offering him a scone, and would not, under any circumstances, comment on any of it. "He sends his regrets," Hermione said. "I'm sure he does. He thought I would manage the florist better alone." He was correct. Narcissa sat down across from her, set her own cup on the small table at her elbow, and folded her hands. "Draco has many gifts. The visual arts are not among them. He once chose, at 14, a wallpaper for his bedroom that I had to have removed within a fortnight. It gave the house elves migraines. I never told him." She paused. "Don't tell him. He still believes he chose well." Hermione, surprised, laughed. It was a small laugh, but a real one, and she saw, for the briefest moment, something at the corner of Narcissa's pale mouth that was not quite a smile, but lived in the same neighborhood as one. "I won't tell him." "Thank you, dear." There was a small silence. The fire in the white hearth made no sound. Somewhere far away in the long gallery, a door opened and closed, and the soft echo of footsteps began the slow approach. "Narcissa," Hermione set her cup down. "May I say something?" "You may say anything you like in this room. I have always been clear about that." Hermione stopped. She started again. "I want you to know that we are grateful, Draco and I, for this, for all of this." She gestured vaguely, meaning the ribbon, the florist, the peacocks, the brochure with the crest, the whole impossible apparatus of Narcissa's intentions. "I know it's a great deal of effort." Narcissa did not answer at once. She looked at Hermione for a long moment over the pale rim of her cup, and her face did the thing it sometimes did. The small, almost imperceptible loosening at the eyes, the slight softening at the mouth, the brief lifting of the practiced public mask to allow for an instant the other woman beneath to look out. The woman who had stood in a forest with her hand on her son's chest and lied to a dark lord. The woman who had not, in 5 years, ever once said the word grandchild aloud because she had not, until 12 weeks ago, believed she would be permitted to. "It is not effort, Hermione," she said very quietly. "It is." She searched a moment for the word, found it, set it down between them as carefully as she had set down the cup. Opportunity. Hermione looked at her hands. "I would like," Narcissa continued in the same low, even voice, "to do this well. I am aware that I do not always, that my instincts in certain matters are not." She stopped, started again with the small, visible effort of a woman who had been raised to never quite say the thing. "I am aware that Molly Weasley will have her own ideas. I am aware that she has been, in many ways, more of a pause, and the word cost her something. More of a mother to you these past years than I have been able to be anything. I am aware of all of this, my dear. I do not require you to soften it." "Narcissa, let me finish, please. It's difficult." She set the teacup down. Her hands, when they returned to her lap, folded one over the other with the deliberate composure of a woman holding herself, by main force, in her chair. "I would like to find a way for there to be room, in this, for both of us, for her and for me. I do not yet know how. I am not." A small, dry, self-deprecating exhalation that in another woman would have been a laugh. "I am not naturally gifted in this particular kind of sharing, but I would like to try. For Draco, and for you, and for—" She did not say it. She could not yet say it. Her eyes only went briefly to Hermione's belly and away again, for the obvious reason. Hermione found that she could not quite speak. She nodded once and reached and laid her hand for a brief instant over Narcissa's, where it rested on the pale silk of her knee. Narcissa did not move her hand away. She did not turn her palm up to take Hermione's either. That would have been a degree of demonstrativeness her body did not yet know how to perform. But she did not move away, and her pale eyes, when they lifted to Hermione's, were very bright. The footsteps in the long gallery had grown closer. Narcissa drew a small, smooth breath. She straightened her cuffs. She became, in the space of half a second, the woman the florist was about to meet, composed, polished, ambient with money. And only the small flush high on each cheekbone and the very faint tremor at the edge of her teacup as she lifted it again would have told anyone watching that anything else had passed in the room at all. The double doors opened. Madame Malfoy, Madame Malfoy the younger. Marlowe, the house elf, bowed nearly to the floor, and behind him swept into the room a small round man in a plum velvet coat, carrying an armload of pale roses and an air of slightly performed exhaustion. Monsieur Aubrey, ma'am. Aubrey, darling. Narcissa rose. You've come. Through the gallery, I hope. Madame, I am destroyed by the gallery. I have not slept. The portraits are watching me. I will be in therapy for weeks. But yes, I have come. And I have brought the moon roses, and the white lisianthus, and the... He caught sight of Hermione, stopped, blinked, recovered, and bowed deeply over the roses. Madame, Madame the younger, forgive me. You are radiant. You are with child. It is in the cheekbones. I see it always in the cheekbones first, and then in the wrists. Do not stand. I beg you. I will arrange. I will only show. Aubrey, you are an angel from the upper regions, said Narcissa smoothly, and gestured him toward the low table by the fire. Show us. The next 40 minutes passed in a soft, escalating, slightly dizzying conversation, conducted almost entirely in shades of white. Aubrey spread roses on the low table, the way a jeweller spreads stones on velvet. He spoke of bone and cream and eggshell and the white of a candle 5 minutes after lighting. He held a single bloom against the silk of Narcissa's cuff and shook his head. He held it against the green of Hermione's sleeve and gasped. He produced, from a flat case lined with black velvet, a single pale flower Hermione had never seen before, pearl-toned, faintly luminous, its petals translucent as porcelain held to a window. From the slopes above Innsbruck, he said reverently. Only in October, only for 3 weeks. I have 12. Hermione, who had spent her childhood in a dental practice in Hampstead, and had never once, in any of her professional dealings with the ministry, been required to have an opinion on a flower, found that she was nodding. She was nodding with a kind of glazed political seriousness, the way one nods at a head of state. Narcissa, across from her, was nodding more authoritatively, occasionally making a small precise gesture that caused Aubrey to either rapture or despair. It was at the height of this. Aubrey on his knees beside the table, 2 roses in each hand, demanding that Hermione choose. Madame, choose. The colder cream or the warmer, the heart of the arrangement depends on it. That the doors opened again. Marlowe, with the expression of an elf who had been given news he did not enjoy carrying, bowed. Madame, he said, in his small, careful voice. There is an owl. From the other Madame. Narcissa, with great composure, set down her teacup. The other, she repeated. Madame Weasley, Madame. It came to the front door. It would not go to the owlery. It is in the hall, Madame. It is being... Marlowe hesitated, casting about for the diplomatic word. Insistent. Aubrey, on his knees, looked from one Malfoy to the other with the avid, undisguised pleasure of a man who has just realized he is about to witness something he will dine out on for a year. Hermione closed her eyes. When she opened them, Narcissa was already on her feet. the dove-grey morning robe falling into perfect lines around her, her pale face composed into the particular smooth neutrality that meant, in the private code of this household, that battle had been joined. "Show the owl in, Marlowe," she said. And Hermione, half a second behind, rose with her hand pressed flat against the place where their daughter, though she did not yet know it was a daughter, slept, the size of a plum, unaware. The owl came in with the dignity of a small queen. It was, of all the Weasley birds, the only one with any pretension to ceremony. Errol's grand-niece, a tawny creature called Pomona, with one slightly drooping eyelid, and a habit of staring at people until they apologized for things they had not yet done. She crossed the white drawing-room in 3 measured hops, ignored the proffered perch Marlowe held out with trembling diplomacy, and landed instead on the back of Hermione's chair. She extended her leg. She did not look at Narcissa. The omission was so deliberate, so finely calibrated, that it amounted to a small avian insult delivered in perfect taste. Hermione untied the letter with fingers that had gone a little cold. The parchment was thick and slightly buttery, the good Burrows stationery Molly kept in a tin and used only for what she called occasions. And the smell of it, the faint, warm domestic smell of a kitchen that had baked something that morning, reached Hermione before she had unfolded a single line. "Hermione, love. I've been thinking, and I don't want to be a bother, but I had a small idea about the cake. I know we said lemon, but Arthur reminded me that Draco's people don't always go in for citrus, and I should ask, so I'm asking. Would he prefer something else? A nice almond, perhaps? I can do a beautiful almond. I'm asking because I want him to have a slice he likes, love. Not just you. Him as well. He's family now, and family eats the cake. Also, and please tell me to mind my own if I'm being silly, I was wondering if the dear lady, your other mother, that is, Mrs. Malfoy, might like to come round to the Burrow one afternoon, just for a cup of tea, the 2 of us. I thought it might be easier to talk over things between just us, rather than across all the fuss. I'd very much like to meet her properly. I don't think we've ever sat down, the 2 of us, and I think perhaps we should. All my love and a kiss for the baby." Molly Hermione read the letter once. She read it again. Then she folded it in her lap with a care that was disproportionate to the action, and she sat very still for several seconds, while the small bright space behind her ribs did something soft and painful. He's family now, and family eats the cake. She did not look up immediately. She could not. There was something on her face that she did not want Narcissa to see. Not because Narcissa would judge it, but because Narcissa had spent the morning offering, in her own clipped and careful way, the closest thing to vulnerability the older woman knew how to give, and Hermione did not want, on top of that, to weep in front of her over a sentence about almond cake. Aubrey, sensitive in the way only theatrical men are sensitive, gathered his roses with sudden brisk efficiency and announced that he had remembered an urgent matter in the South Conservatory and would return in 20 minutes. 20 exactly. "Madame, do not let the moon roses near the window in this light." He bowed himself out. Marlowe, with one wide-eyed glance, vanished after him. The doors closed. The fire in the white marble hearth burned without sound. "Hermione!" Narcissa's voice, when it came, was very level. "What does she say?" Hermione lifted her face at last. She thought briefly about offering an edited version. She decided against it. She had not, in 5 years, ever lied to Narcissa Malfoy about anything that mattered, and she was not going to begin now over a piece of buttery parchment. She wants to know, Hermione said carefully, whether Draco would prefer almond cake to lemon. Because she swallowed once. Because she wants him to have a slice he likes. Because he's family now. Something happened in Narcissa's face. It was not a movement exactly. Narcissa Malfoy did not move her face in the gross way ordinary faces moved. It was, rather, a small redistribution of the light beneath the skin. The kind of internal shift one might detect in the surface of a still pond when a stone has been dropped into it from a great height, very far away. The pale eyes did not fill. The pale mouth did not tremble. But the woman behind the face had taken, somewhere in her chest, a small, unexpected impact, and she was, for the space of perhaps 3 seconds, occupied entirely with absorbing it. "I see," she said. And Hermione pressed on, because to stop now would be to leave Narcissa stranded with whatever was happening behind her composure. "She would like to invite you to tea, at the Burrow, the 2 of you, to talk about—" She gestured vaguely at the roses, the ribbon, the whole accumulating weight of the week. All of this, without us. There was a long pause. Narcissa rose. She crossed slowly to the tall window where she had stood when Hermione first came in. She looked out for a moment at the grey October garden, at the box hedges trimmed to within an inch of their tolerance, at the pale gravel walk where her son had, as a small boy, once fallen off a toy broomstick and refused for an entire afternoon to be comforted by anyone but his mother. "Tea," she said to the window. "Tea. At the Burrow. Yes. With Molly Weasley. Yes." Another long pause. Narcissa's hand rose and rested very lightly against the cold pane of the window. Her wedding ring, a thin antique band she had never replaced, bit a small bright line against the glass. "She is a generous woman, isn't she?" Narcissa said. It was not quite a question. "Yes," said Hermione, and her voice cracked very slightly on the single syllable. "She is." The silence after that was not uncomfortable. It was the kind of silence that lives between 2 people who have just discovered, without quite admitting it, that they are on the same side of something neither of them was previously sure had sides. Pomona the owl, perched on the back of Hermione's chair, ruffled her feathers once and resettled. She still did not look at Narcissa, but she was, perhaps, looking at her slightly less pointedly. "Tell her," Narcissa said at last, without turning from the window, "that I will come on Thursday, at 4, and tell her that Draco does, in fact, like lemon. He has liked lemon since he was 6. He thinks no one knows. It is one of his small pretensions. The almond is a kindness, but it is not necessary." Hermione, against her own intention, gave a small wet laugh. "I'll tell her. And Hermione." "Yes." Narcissa turned at last. Her face had recomposed itself into its usual cool symmetry, and only the very slightly heightened colour along her cheekbones, and the way she had clasped her hands in front of her at the waist, as though to keep them from doing something undignified, would have told anyone watching that the previous 5 minutes had occurred. "Tell her also that I am—" She paused, found the word, set it down with the same care she had used before. I am grateful for what she has been to you. I am not. A small, dry breath. I am not a woman who finds it easy to be grateful for the kindnesses of others to my own. But I am, in this particular instance. Please tell her. I'll tell her. Word for word, Hermione. Word for word. Good. Narcissa drew in a long breath. She let it out. She crossed back to her chair and sat down with the smooth efficiency of a woman returning to a stage. Now, Marlowe will bring Aubrey back, and we will choose the moon roses, because they are the correct flower whether anyone else realizes it or not. And we will not speak of any of this again until Thursday. Are we agreed? Agreed. Excellent. A small pause. The pale eyes flicked once, very briefly, to the Burrow letter still folded in Hermione's lap. And the baby may have the kiss, when the time comes, from both of us. Hermione could not speak. She nodded. She nodded twice. She put one hand on her belly, and this time she did not stop herself, and Narcissa, watching, said nothing, and the other hand on Pomona's warm feathered back, and she sat for a moment with both hands occupied in a white room, while the fire burned silently and a small brown letter rested in her lap. At the same hour, 2 counties away, Draco Malfoy was sitting at the long scrubbed kitchen table of the Burrow, with a half-eaten scone in front of him, a cup of tea steaming at his elbow, and the slow growing realization that he had been outflanked. The scone, it had to be said, was excellent. It was warm. It had currants in it. Molly Weasley had set it down in front of him with the brisk efficiency of a woman who had been feeding men against their will for 30 years. And she had said, without looking at him, "Eat that. You've gone thin." Hermione doesn't notice, but I do. And she had moved on to the kettle before he could organize a refusal. He had eaten the scone. He was, in fact, on his second scone, which had appeared on his plate without consultation, roughly 4 minutes after the first one disappeared, and he had not yet decided whether to be irritated about it or grateful, and so he had compromised by eating it in small, dignified bites, while looking at a point somewhere over Molly's left shoulder. Arthur Weasley sat at the far end of the table with a small mechanical object in front of him, a wristwatch, possibly Muggle, partially disassembled, and a screwdriver that he was using with the absorbed pleasure of a man who had retired and had not, at any point since, looked back. He had greeted Draco with a warm handshake, a pat on the shoulder, and the words, "Good, good. Sit down, lad. Molly's been baking all morning. You'll do us a favour by eating it," and had then immediately returned to his watch, leaving Draco to manage Molly alone. This, Draco understood now, had been strategy. Draco, love. Molly came around the table and set down beside the teapot a small cloth-wrapped bundle. She did not sit. She unwrapped the bundle slowly, the way one unwraps a relic. "I want to show you something. Tell me honestly. I won't be cross." Inside the cloth were the gloves. There were 6 pair, 3 pink, 3 blue. Each pair was no larger than the curl of a man's fist. Each had, at the cuff, a tiny scalloped trim. Each had, at the back, a small embroidered initial, M, in slightly uneven stitches, the way an M comes out when one is sewing with old eyes by lamplight. "For the baby," Molly said unnecessarily. "I started them the night Hermione owled. I haven't slept properly. I keep doing the thumbs wrong on the blue, and I have to take them back. The pink is easier. I don't know why." Draco looked at the gloves. He did not, for a moment, trust himself to speak. He picked one up, a blue one with a thumb that had clearly been redone, and held it in his palm. It weighed almost nothing. It fit almost exactly across the center of his hand. He thought, with a brief, sharp lurch, a hand will go inside this. A hand the size of a leaf, my child's hand. And he had to put the glove down and pick up his tea instead, and he had to take a swallow of it, and he had to set the cup down carefully so that it did not rattle in the saucer. There. His voice came out lower than he meant it. He cleared his throat. They're very fine, Mrs. Weasley. Molly. Molly? Are they really love? Truthfully? Hermione said you'd be polite even if you hated them. She said I wasn't to take a polite answer for an honest one. He looked up at her then. She was standing at the side of the table with the tea towel still in her hands, and her face was open in the way Molly Weasley's face was always open. There was no mask, there was no calibration. There was only a small round woman with flower in the cuff of her sleeve and a question in her eyes. And she was looking at him as though his answer mattered very much. He thought, with the dry, distant part of his mind that had not yet been overrun, that Narcissa Malfoy would die before she stood in a kitchen with flour on her cuff and asked a question with her whole face. And he thought, with a different part, that Hermione had grown up, was still growing up in the strange suspended way of a woman whose own parents could not know her, beside this woman who asked questions with her whole face and who made cakes in case the husband did not like citrus, and who had decided, without consulting anyone, that he was family now, and family ate the cake. They're beautiful, he said, honestly. They're Molly. They're beautiful. The baby will... And here, to his own complete horror, his voice did something it had not done in front of another human being in over a decade. The baby will be very lucky. Molly Weasley sat down in the chair beside him. She did not say anything. She did not mercifully touch him. She only sat down very quietly, and she folded her hands in her lap, and she looked at the gloves on the cloth on the table, and she let him have, in the warm, currant-smelling kitchen, the small private minute he needed to put himself back together. Arthur, at the far end, turned a small screw with great concentration and did not look up. The kettle, which had been silent, began very softly to sing. They met that night, husband and wife, at the foot of the great staircase in the east wing. Neither had planned it. Hermione had come down for a glass of water at 11:30, drifting through the dark corridors in her bare feet and one of Draco's shirts, her hair a soft, loose tangle down her back. Draco had come up from the library where he had been pretending for 2 hours to read a contract from the firm and had not turned a page in 40 minutes. They met on the 3rd stair from the bottom, in the small pool of light cast by a single sconce, and for a moment they only looked at each other. He had loosened his collar. His sleeves were rolled to the elbow. There was an ink smudge on the side of his left hand that he had not noticed. She had a glass already in her hand. She had filled it in the upper kitchen and forgotten, somewhere between the 2nd floor and the 1st, that she had filled it. "You ate the scone," she said, by way of greeting. "I ate 2 scones. 2. She put the 2nd one on the plate, Granger," What was I to do? Refuse her? In her own kitchen? You could have. I could not have. The woman has weaponized baked goods. I am not equipped. He came up the third stair and stopped one step below her, so that their eyes were almost level. She showed me the gloves. Oh, all 6 pair. The blue ones have an M on them. The thumbs are slightly crooked. Draco? I held one, in my hand. He lifted his palms slowly between them, the long, pale palm she knew the lines of by heart, and turned it so that the sconce light caught it. It was the size of this, a little smaller perhaps, just here. She set the water glass down on the banister. She did not say anything. She took his lifted hand in both of hers, the ink-smudged left one, and she held it for a moment, palm up between them. Then she folded his fingers closed around nothing, and she lifted his closed fist, and she pressed it very lightly to the soft front of her shirt over her belly. Like that, she said. About like that. Mine. His eyes closed. He stood there for a long moment with his fist held against her belly and her hands folded over his fist, and the sconce light fell on his bent fair head and on the soft white of her shirt, and a clock in some other part of the manor chimed the half-hour in a slow, low note that seemed to come from inside the walls themselves. "Granger," he said, without opening his eyes. I am going to be very bad at this." "At what?" "At..." His free hand made a small abortive gesture in the air. "This. All of it. The holding of small things. The not saying the wrong thing. The not being..." He stopped. His mouth made a small, dry shape that was not quite a smile and not quite anything else. The not being him. She did not pretend not to know whom he meant. She drew his fist away from her belly, and she opened his fingers one by one, the way one opens the fingers of a child who has been holding something too tightly. And she pressed his open palm flat against the place where their daughter slept, and she laid her own hand over the back of his, and she held it there. "You are not him," she said, very low, very steady. "You are not him, Draco. You will never be him. You are the man who ate 2 scones at the Burrow because Molly Weasley needed you to. You are the man who held a glove in his hand and could not speak. You are not him. You don't know. I know. What I am underneath, Hermione, you don't... I know." She said it with such quiet certainty, such complete, unfussed authority, that he opened his eyes at last. The grey of them was very bright in the sconce light. There was a small, almost imperceptible roughness at the edges of them. Not quite tears, only the suggestion of where tears would be if he had been the kind of man who let them. And she looked at him without flinching, the way she had looked at him for 5 years, and she did not move her hand from over his on her belly. "I know what you are underneath," she said. "I married it. I sleep beside it. I made a child with it. Do you think I would have done any of that, Draco Malfoy, if I were not absolutely sure?" He looked at her. There were a great many things he might have said. He had, in fact, a small library of things he had been saving up to say to her on appropriate occasions over the course of their marriage. Small, careful speeches, drafted in his head during long meetings, polished in the bath, never delivered. He chose, instead, to say nothing. He turned his hand under hers so that their fingers laced over her belly, and he bent his head, and he rested his forehead against hers, and they stood on the staircase in the small pool of light for what felt like a very long time, and was probably less than a minute. "Bed," she said at last, against his mouth. "Bed," he agreed. The week unspooled. Tuesday. Hermione spent 3 hours at the ministry pretending to listen to a report on cauldron bottom thickness regulations, while Aubrey, somewhere in the south of France, owled her hourly updates on the Moon Rose's transit. At 11 that night, she received a parcel from Narcissa containing 14 swatches of cream silk and a card reading, "Darling, by Friday, please." At 11:12, she received a second parcel from Molly containing a hand-knitted hot water bottle cover in lemon yellow and a card reading, "For the small of your back. Love. I had terrible aches with all of mine." She put the silk swatches in a drawer. She put the hot water bottle cover on her chair. She did not, in any letter to either woman, mention the existence of the other parcel. Wednesday. Draco was ambushed in the long gallery by his mother holding a sample of marble. "Carrara or Calicut, darling? Decide quickly." He had stared at the 2 slabs of stone for a full 30 seconds before saying, with the calm of a man under torture, "The left one, mother." Narcissa had looked at him with grave disappointment and said, "Draco, the right one. Obviously, the veining is finer. I shall pretend you did not say that," and had swept on. He had stood in the gallery for another full minute, looking at the closed doors she had vanished through, and had said to the empty air, "She asked." That afternoon, a small brown owl had arrived at his office at the firm bearing a folded note in green ink. "Draco, love. Just a quick one. If you fancy a quiet pint with Arthur on Saturday after the do, he says you'd be welcome. No pressure. M." He had read it 3 times. He had folded it. He had put it very carefully in the breast pocket of his coat, next to the small folded square of the sonogram. He had returned, with great seriousness, to a contract. His secretary, passing 20 minutes later, had observed that Mr. Malfoy was once more failing to turn pages, and had said nothing, because Mr. Malfoy's secretary was a woman of discretion and a great salary. Thursday. The tea at the Burrow. Neither Hermione nor Draco was present. They had agreed, after some discussion, that to be present would be to interfere with whatever was going to happen, and that whatever was going to happen needed to happen without them. They spent the afternoon instead in the East Wing kitchen, ostensibly working, she on a brief, he on the contract that he had still not turned a page of, and in actuality watching the clock above the door with the focused, helpless attention of parents whose children are taking an examination in another room. At 4:15, Hermione said, "Do you think they've started?" At 4:20, Draco said, "Do you think they've finished?" At 4:32, Hermione said, "Do you think one of them has killed the other?" At 4:45, Draco set down his quill and said, with the bleak honesty of a man at the end of his resources, "Granger, if they have killed each other, I am genuinely uncertain which of us would be in more trouble." At 5:03, an owl arrived. It was, surprisingly, neither Pomona nor the pale eagle. It was a small grey nondescript bird, of the kind one hired by the hour from the Central Post Office, and it bore a single sheet of parchment that had clearly been written in 2 different hands. The first hand was Molly's, round, green, slightly blotted at the loops. "Hermione, love. We had a lovely tea. lemon cake. She had 2 slices. Don't tell her I told you. XX. The second hand was Narcissa's, narrow, sloping in the blue-black ink she favoured. Hermione, dear, the cake was, in fact, very good. Mrs. Weasley is a woman of considerable substance. I find I have agreed to several things. I shall explain on Friday. Do not be alarmed. N. Hermione and Draco sat at the kitchen table with a single sheet of parchment between them and read it through twice without speaking. Granger. Yes. Are we? I don't know. Is this? I genuinely have no idea. They had cake together. They had cake together. My mother said substance. Yes. Your mother said don't tell her I told you. Yes. They looked at each other across the oak table. The autumn light through the leaded glass had gone the soft gold of late afternoon, and it caught in Hermione's loose hair and turned a strand of it copper. And Draco was looking at the copper strand the way a man looks at something he has only just noticed is beautiful for the 40th time. I think, he said slowly, that we may have just been outmaneuvered by our own mothers. I think you may be right. I think, Granger, I think they may have liked each other. That can't be right. It can't. It's not possible. It is not. They sat for another long moment. Then Hermione very slowly began to laugh. It was a small laugh at first, a startled, slightly hysterical thing. And then it grew, and Draco, watching her, began to laugh as well, and within 30 seconds they were both laughing in the soft gold kitchen light. Helplessly, the kind of laughter that comes only at the end of a long-held breath. And Hermione had one hand pressed to her belly and the other to her mouth, and Draco had his forehead on the table and his shoulders were shaking. And somewhere in the corner of the kitchen, the small grey hired owl, bewildered by the noise, took itself off through the open window without waiting for a reply. When they had recovered, when Hermione was wiping her eyes with the back of her wrist, and Draco had lifted his head and was looking at her with the soft, astonished expression of a man who could not quite believe his own life, she reached and took his hand across the table and laid it once more on her belly. The gesture had become, in the space of 1 week, a kind of small private prayer they performed without comment. Friday, she said. Friday, he answered, and then Saturday, and then Saturday, and then it's over, and then it's over. Neither of them, in that golden moment, quite believed that the worst of it was behind them. They were not naive people. They had been married 5 years. They knew the way mothers were, and the way weeks were, and the way large parties were, and they knew that agreed to several things in Narcissa Malfoy's hand was a sentence that could contain, without exaggeration, almost anything. But they sat in the kitchen with the late light gold on the oak, and their hands joined over the small unseen fact of their daughter. And they allowed themselves, for the length of that one quiet hour before the next owl arrived, the small luxury of believing that they had, perhaps against every expectation, survived the middle of the week. The next owl arrived at 6:11. It was Pomona. She came in through the kitchen window with the slow, unhurried dignity of a creature on important business, and she landed on the back of Hermione's chair, and she extended her leg with the patience of a small queen, and the parchment tied to it was thick and buttery, and the smell of it, when Hermione untied it, was the smell of a kitchen that had baked something that afternoon, and the first line, written in green ink, slightly blotted at the loops, said only, "Hermione, love, there is going to be a problem about the dress." The dress was, of course, the breaking point. It was always going to be the dress. Hermione understood this later, with the clear vision that comes only after a storm. But on Friday morning at 10 minutes to 10, she understood only that she was standing on a small velvet-covered dais in the back room of Madame Lavinia's on Diagon Alley, in her shift, with her bare feet sinking into a carpet the colour of clotted cream, and that her mother-in-law and her surrogate mother had arrived at precisely the same moment from precisely opposite directions, and that Madame Lavinia herself, a tall, severe woman who had dressed 3 generations of black women and was not afraid of any of them, had taken one look at the configuration and quietly closed the door of the fitting room and gone, with great composure, to fetch the brandy. "Cream," said Narcissa. "Yellow," said Molly. There was a very small pause. "Yellow," Narcissa repeated in a voice of careful neutrality, as one might repeat the name of an unfamiliar pest. "Buttercup yellow, Mrs. Malfoy, dear. It's so cheerful for an autumn morning, and with Hermione's colouring. Mrs. Weasley." Narcissa's hands folded themselves in front of her at the waist. The seed pearls at her cuffs caught the lamplight. "I do not wish to begin our acquaintance with disagreement, but Hermione is pregnant, and yellow on a pregnant woman in October will read in any photograph as jaundiced. We will be looking at these photographs for the rest of our lives." "Oh, I don't think. I do think. I think very firmly. Cream is correct. Cream with the smallest, the most discreet possible suggestion of green at the shoulder to bring out her eyes. I have already had Madame prepare the silk." "You've already—" "I sent it round on Tuesday." There was another, smaller, sharper pause. Hermione, on the dais, in her shift, with her hands folded protectively in front of the soft, small swell that was just, only just, beginning to be visible if one knew where to look, became aware that the air in the fitting room had developed a particular quality. It was the quality the air took on in a room before a hex was cast. A faint, dry tightness, as though the lamps had drawn back their light by half a notch. "Narcissa," she said. "Yes, darling." "Molly?" "Yes, love." "Perhaps—" "I will not be high-handed about this," said Narcissa, who was being high-handed about it. "I will only say that there are certain standards that attach to a Malfoy event, regardless of its private nature, and that yellow, however cheerful, is not." "It's not a Malfoy event," said Molly. Her voice was perfectly pleasant. She had not raised it. She was still holding in her hands a small folded square of buttercup yellow silk, which she had brought all the way from the burrow in her largest reticule, and her round face was as open and as warm as it had been in her own kitchen 3 days earlier. But there was, beneath the pleasantness, a small new firmness, the firmness of a woman who had buried a son and raised 6 others, and who knew, in her bones, when she was being moved aside. "I'm sorry," said Narcissa. "I said it's not a Malfoy event, dear." Molly smiled. The smile was kind. The smile was also, in some way Hermione could not quite name, the most formidable thing she had ever seen on Molly Weasley's face. "It's Hermione's event, and Draco's, and we, you and I, we are the grandmothers, dear. We are not the hosts. We are the— Well, we are the background, and in the background a little yellow, I think, won't do any harm. Mrs. Weasley. Molly. Molly, I do not wish to be... I know you don't, dear. But I have, in fact, paid. And that's lovely of you, truly. I've never had anything like the sort of money you've got, and I should think it must be a great relief to be able to put one's hand on a thing and have it done. But Hermione is my girl too, and I have a yellow silk that her own mother, if she... And here Molly's voice did, for the first time, a small soft thing. If she had been here, if she had, dear, I think she'd have liked it. I think she'd have liked yellow on her girl. That's all I'm saying. Just a little. At the sleeve, perhaps, where the cream meets the wrist. The silence that followed this was of a different order than any silence the fitting room had yet contained. Narcissa Malfoy looked at Molly Weasley. Molly Weasley looked back. Hermione, on the dais, in her shift, felt the small bright space behind her ribs do the painful soft thing it had been doing all week, and she closed her eyes for the briefest second because she could not, just then, look at either of them. Narcissa drew in a long, slow breath. I see, she said. I'm sorry, dear, said Molly. If I... No. Narcissa lifted one hand very slightly. Please, don't apologize. I was... And here, for a moment, the polished surface of Narcissa Malfoy moved aside an inch, and the woman beneath it looked out, slightly tired, slightly less composed. I was being high-handed, as you say. I do that. I'm afraid I will continue to do it. It is not a virtue. It is only a habit of a long life lived in a particular way. Oh, Mrs. Malfoy. Narcissa, please. Narcissa. Then Molly. Molly? They looked at each other for another long moment in the fitting room, with the lamplight soft on the cream carpet and on Hermione standing on her dais between them, and something in the quality of the air shifted again. The dry tightness eased. The lamps, almost imperceptibly, brightened by a notch. At the sleeve, said Narcissa slowly, where the cream meets the wrist. Just a little, said Molly. A band, no wider than my finger. With, perhaps... Narcissa's eyes narrowed in professional consideration. A very small, very fine cream embroidery, worked over the yellow, so that it picks up the light only when she moves. Oh, breathed Molly. Oh, yes, yes, that would be, yes. I'll speak to Madame Lavinia. I'll help. They turned, both of them, as if on the same thought, and went out of the fitting room together. The door closed behind them with a small, quiet click. From the front of the shop came the low murmur of two women's voices, conferring, and then, after a moment, the high crystalline laugh of Madame Lavinia, who had clearly produced the brandy. Hermione, alone on her dais in her shift, sat down very slowly on the velvet step at the edge of the platform and put her face in her hands and cried. She cried for perhaps 2 minutes. She cried quietly because she had been a quiet crier since she was a child, and the only sound she made was a soft, uneven catching at the back of her throat. She cried because Molly Weasley had said, if she had been here, if she had. She cried because Narcissa Malfoy had said, I will continue to do it. She cried because the small bright space behind her ribs was full, suddenly, of a great hot ache of love for two women who had no reason to love each other, and were, against every probability, doing it anyway. And she cried because she was tired and pregnant and standing in her shift on a velvet dais. And her own mother was on the other side of the world under another name, and would not ever see her in any colour of silk at all. When she lifted her face, the door had opened again, very softly, and Draco was standing in it. He had come to fetch her at noon. It was 10 past noon. He was wearing the dark coat she liked. He had taken his hat off and was holding it in both hands, and he was looking at her, barefooted and red-eyed on the velvet step, with an expression that did not require any speech at all. He crossed the cream carpet. He sat down on the step beside her without a word. He set his hat on the floor. He took her very carefully into both his arms, the way one lifts something one is not sure is whole. And he drew her against the front of his coat, and he put his hand on the back of her head, and he held her. She wept into the dark wool of his shoulder for a little while longer. He did not speak. He did not ask. He only held her, and she could feel the slow, steady move of his breath under her cheek, and the faint, clean cedar smell of him, and the small bite of the silver pin at his lapel against her temple. And after a time, the weeping eased, and she was simply leaning against him in her shift on the velvet step, with his hand on the back of her head and his cheek against her hair. "They've agreed about the dress," she said into his shoulder. "Yes, I gathered. Madame Lavinia is pouring brandy in the front room. Molly said if she had been here." His hand on the back of her head tightened very slightly. "And your mother said she would continue to be high-handed." That sounds like Mother. It was the kindest thing she has ever said. Yes. He drew back only a little, only enough to look at her face. He used the edge of his thumb very lightly to wipe a tear from the soft skin under her eye. He did it the way he did everything when she was at the edge of herself, carefully, without hurry, as though she was something he was determined not to bruise. "Granger, listen to me. Tomorrow is the party. And then it is over. And then it is only us. You and me and..." His free hand came to rest, low and warm, against the small soft swell of her belly through the thin shift. "And her. Or him." "Her," she said suddenly, without thinking. He went very still. "What?" She lifted her face. Her wet eyes met his. "Her," she said again. The word came up out of her without permission, as if it had been waiting at the back of her throat all week for the right moment. "I think, Draco, I think I've known, since Tuesday. I haven't said. I thought I didn't want to say it before. I didn't want to be wrong. But, Granger, I think it's a girl. Granger. I think it's a girl, Draco." He looked at her. His hand on her belly did not move. His other hand on the back of her head did not move. His grey eyes, very near her own in the lamplight, did the thing they did so rarely. The thing where the careful Malfoy guard was simply, briefly, not there, and what was underneath looked out without armour. He drew her face to his, very slowly, and he kissed her. It was not a hungry kiss. It was not a hurried one. It was a kiss that took its time, that began at the corner of her mouth, the way his kisses always began, and then moved to the centre and stayed there. His hand cradled the back of her head. Her own hand, of its own volition, came up and pressed flat against the front of his coat over his heart, and she felt beneath her palm the strong, unhurried, answering beat of him, and the kiss deepened, not into passion, not into anything as simple as that, but into the slow-held thing that two people do who have, in the middle of a long week, come back to each other across an enormous distance and want, for a moment, only to be sure. When he drew back, his forehead came to rest against hers. "A girl," he said, against her mouth. "A girl," she answered. "We'll keep it," he said. "Between us, until tomorrow. We won't tell them. No, just ours. For one more day. Just ours." From the front of the shop came the bright, slightly tipsy sound of Molly Weasley saying something earnest, and Narcissa Malfoy astonishingly laughing. A small, startled, real laugh, the kind that escapes before the woman who owns it can catch it. Madame Lavinia's voice rose above them both, ringing for more glasses. In the back room, on a velvet step, in her shift, in her husband's arms, Hermione Granger closed her eyes and held, between her ribs, the one bright secret she would carry for one more night. The morning of the party broke quiet and cold. Hermione woke before the alarm, before Draco even, which almost never happened, and lay for a long minute on her back in the soft grey light, listening to the rain that had begun in the small hours and was still going, a fine, patient autumn rain against the high windows. The room smelled of him, and of clean linen, and faintly, somewhere beneath that, of the bowl of white roses Marlowe had brought up at midnight without being asked. She turned her head on the pillow. Draco was still asleep, one bare arm flung across the white duvet, the other folded beneath his cheek. His hair had fallen across his forehead. There was a faint pillow crease on his cheek. He looked, in sleep, much younger than he was, younger than she usually allowed herself to notice, because to notice it in the daylight would be to remember that they had been children, both of them, in the long-ago war that had made them, and she could not always afford to remember that. She let herself look at him for a slow count of 10. Then she laid her hand, very lightly, on the soft, small swell of her belly under the linen, and she said, in her head, the way she had been saying it all week, "Good morning, darling." And she got, in answer, what she always got, which was nothing at all, only the warm, dim certainty of her own body, which she had decided, somewhere in the middle of the week, to take as enough. She slipped out from under the duvet. The dress was hanging on the inside of the wardrobe door, ghost pale in the early light. Madame Lavinia had sent it round the previous evening in a long, flat box lined with tissue, and Hermione had not yet quite been able to look at it directly. She did so now. She crossed the cold floor in her bare feet and stood in front of it, and she lifted, with the tip of one finger, the soft cream silk of the sleeve. At the cuff, where the cream met her wrist, there was a band of buttercup yellow, no wider than her finger, and worked over the yellow in cream silk so fine it could not be seen except when the light moved, was a small running embroidery of leaves. She stood for a long moment with the cuff between her fingers. Then she pressed it very lightly against her cheek, and she closed her eyes, and she stood like that, pregnant, barefoot, in her husband's shirt at 6 in the morning, until she had finished what needed finishing inside her chest. "Granger." She turned. He was up on one elbow in the bed, watching her, his hair still in his eyes. "You're up early," he said. "I couldn't sleep." come back. In a minute. Granger, come back." She came back. She slipped under the duvet and into the warm shape of him, and he curled himself around her without quite waking the rest of the way, and his hand came to rest, with the unthinking accuracy it had developed over the week, low and flat on her belly. He pressed his face into the back of her neck. He breathed there for a moment. "Today," he said. "Today. Are you frightened?" "A little." "Of what?" She thought about it. "Of being looked at," she said at last. "By everyone. With everyone knowing. I've been keeping her all this week, just inside. And today, everyone will know about her. And I don't know what it will feel like. To have her be outside of me that way. In the room. Even before she's born." He did not answer for a moment. Then he said, very low, into the back of her neck, "I will be standing next to you, Granger, the entire time. If anyone looks at you in a way you don't like, I will glare at them in my mother's manner, and they will discover urgent business elsewhere. I am very good at it. Mother trained me." She laughed. It was a small, wet laugh. She turned in his arms and laid her face against the warm, bare skin of his throat and breathed him in. "All right," she said. "All right." They lay like that, in the grey light, until the rain shifted and the clock somewhere downstairs chimed the half-hour. And then Marlowe knocked discreetly on the outer door of the bedroom to say that Madame the Elder had arrived in the small drawing-room and was requesting, he said, with very careful diplomacy, the favour of Madame the Younger's attention before breakfast, if convenient. The party was set for 3:00. By 2, the great east garden of the manor had been transformed into something Hermione, walking through it on Draco's arm, could not quite reconcile with the rough, damp lawn she had crossed at breakfast. The compromise, the thing Molly and Narcissa had, astonishingly, agreed upon over brandy at Madame Lavinia's and lemon cake at the Burrow, was a thing neither of them, alone, would ever have made. A long oak table had been brought out from somewhere in the Burrow's depths and set down the centre of the lawn, scarred and warm and unpretentious, but draped now in pale linen and set with Narcissa's grandmother's crystal. Down the centre of the table ran a low, loose garland of moon roses, white lisianthus, and, at intervals, with great deliberation, small bright sprigs of yellow chrysanthemum. The string quartet that Narcissa had commissioned was tuning quietly under a white canopy near the rose walk. Beside them, leaning against a tree with a fiddle on his knee, was George Weasley, who had been added to the programme at Molly's request, and was already, by the look of him, planning to play something the quartet had not rehearsed. There were no peacocks. The peacocks had been, with great regret, retired. Narcissa had explained over breakfast that she had been persuaded by Mrs. Weasley that the lawn was too damp for the birds, who had been bred in the dry Swiss air and would catch cold. She had said it with such a beautifully straight face that Hermione, across the table, had to take a long sip of her tea to keep from openly weeping. In their place, on the long table, between the crystal, sat 7 of Molly's hand-knitted creations, gloves and booties and small caps in alternating pink and blue and one in yellow, arranged in a soft woolen line that Aubrey, after one long appalled look, had declared unexpectedly transcendent and incorporated into his design. The guests began to arrive at 2:30. They came through the long gallery in pairs and small groups. Ginny on Harry's arm, very obviously pregnant herself, 6 weeks ahead of Hermione and already complaining cheerfully about her feet. Ron with Pansy, of all people, on his arm, the two of them arguing in lowered voices about something incomprehensible that had apparently begun in the carriage. Luna in something silver and floating that did not seem to be quite a dress. Neville, broad-shouldered and quiet, with Hannah. Arthur in his best coat, beaming at everyone. George with his fiddle case. Bill and Fleur. Andromeda Tonks, with small Teddy, now 8 years old and very serious, in a tiny dress robe. Narcissa, who had not seen her sister in months, met her at the door of the gallery, and they embraced, briefly, with the careful formality of two women who had been doing this carefully for 5 years now. And Hermione, watching from the rose walk, saw Andromeda lay her hand, very lightly, for one moment, on Narcissa's cheek. At 10 minutes to 3, Hermione went up alone to the small drawing-room to fetch the envelope. She had written it that morning, before breakfast, in her own hand. Inside was a single folded sheet of cream parchment on which she had written one word in green ink. She had chosen the green because Molly always wrote in green, and because, in some way she could not quite articulate, she wanted Molly's colour to be the one that delivered the news. She slid the envelope inside the small flat silver case Narcissa had given her on Tuesday, a thing about the size of her palm, antique, engraved with a tiny lily, and she closed it. She stood for a long moment at the window of the small drawing-room with the silver case in her hand, looking down at the garden. From above, the long oak table looked like a pale ribbon laid across the green of the lawn. The guests had gathered around it in a loose ring. She could see Molly in her best dark blue, fussing with one of the woolen caps. She could see Narcissa in dove grey, conferring with Aubrey about an angle of light. She could see Draco at the head of the table, his hands behind his back, his fair head bent slightly, as Arthur Weasley said something to him that made the corner of his mouth lift in the small, reluctant way she knew. She put her hand on her belly. "All right, darling," she said softly to the small, unseen fact of her daughter. "Time to be looked at." She went down. The reveal had been Hermione's idea. She had refused, with great firmness, the cake-cutting that Narcissa had initially proposed. "Too obvious, darling. Every couple in the country is doing them." She had refused, with equal firmness, the burst of pink or blue smoke that Molly had read about in a magazine. It would frighten the owls, love, and there are children. She had asked, instead, for something quieter. A single candle, she had said, on the table, unlit, white. And at the right moment, when everyone was there, Draco would light it. And the flame, by a small enchantment Hermione had worked herself the previous evening in the library, would burn for the first 3 seconds in the colour of their child. Pink for a daughter, blue for a son. Nothing fancy. 3 seconds. Then the candle would burn ordinary gold for the rest of the afternoon. Narcissa had thought about this for a long moment, and then said, "Yes, Hermione, that is correct." Molly had thought about it for a longer moment, and then said, "Oh, love, that's lovely. That's just lovely." And so it had been decided. The candle was waiting on the table now in a small silver holder Andromeda had brought from her own house. A thing that had belonged, she said, to their mother, and to her mother before that. It sat between the moon roses and a small blue knitted booty, and it was, in the soft grey afternoon light, almost the only thing on the table that was not, in some way, white. Hermione took her place beside Draco at the head of the table. She did not look at the candle. She looked for one long moment at the faces, at Molly, whose eyes were already bright, at Narcissa, who was holding her hands in front of her at the waist with such determined composure that Hermione knew with absolute certainty that the older woman had cried twice already that morning and was not going to permit herself a third time in public. At Andromeda with her hand on Teddy's small shoulder, at Ginny with her own hand on her own belly, mirroring, without meaning to, the gesture Hermione herself was making. At Draco, beside her, very still. He had the small box of long matches in his hand. Molly had given it to him that morning, with great seriousness, because a wand is too... well, a wand isn't quite right, love, for a candle that means something. He had taken the matchbox and turned it in his hand and said only, "Yes, Molly, thank you." He looked now at Hermione. "Granger," he said quietly, "are you ready?" "Yes." "Together. Together." He struck the match. A small flare of it in the grey afternoon was sudden and warm. He bent his head. He lit the candle. The flame caught at the wick and steadied, pale, ordinary, gold. And for the briefest second, Hermione thought, with a small swooping plunge of her stomach, that she had done the enchantment wrong, that the spell had failed, that she would have to announce it with her voice after all. And then the gold of the flame deepened. It went all at once, the soft, warm pink of the inside of a shell. The pink held. It held for 1 second, and then another, and then a third. The soft, warm pink of the inside of a shell, of a rose held against a window, of the first light of a morning that had not quite decided to be day. It threw a small, bright, rosy wash across the white linen of the table, across the moon roses, across the cream silk of Hermione's sleeve, where it lay close to her wrist. It caught in the crystal and broke into a dozen small pink stars. It caught in Draco's pale hair and turned it, for that brief, impossible moment, the colour of dawn. A girl. The garden held its breath. Molly Weasley made a small sound. Not a word, not quite a sob, only the soft, involuntary sound a woman makes when her chest has done something she did not give it permission to do. And she pressed both her hands flat against her mouth. Her eyes, above her hands, had gone very wide and very wet, and she was looking at the candle as though it were a thing she had been waiting her whole life to see. Narcissa Malfoy did not move. She stood perfectly still in her dove grey, her hands folded in front of her at the waist, as they had been all afternoon, and only her face, only the slow, almost imperceptible loosening at the corners of her mouth, only the way her pale eyes shone suddenly bright in the rosy light, told anyone watching that anything at all had happened. She did not weep. She did not raise her hand. She only stood very straight, very composed, and the small sheen at her eyes caught the pink of the flame and held it. And then, at the third second, the flame deepened again, slowly, gently, back into ordinary gold. The candle settled. It burned quietly. The garden, which had held its breath, let it out in a great soft rush That was not quite a cheer and not quite a sigh, but something in between. And Ginny burst into tears, and Arthur Weasley said, "Oh," in a low, surprised voice. And George, who had lifted his fiddle to his shoulder the moment the pink had caught, drew his bow across the strings, and the small, clear singing note that came out of it was the first note of a tune Hermione did not know. Molly knew it. She knew it at once. Her hands came down from her mouth, and her wet face broke into the smile Hermione had been watching her whole adult life, the wide, unguarded, entirely Molly smile. And she said into the soft pink gold light, "Oh, George, you didn't." And George, his eyes wicked above the fiddle, said, "I did, Mum," and went on playing. It was an old lullaby, a simple one. The sort of tune a grandmother hums at a cradle without thinking, the sort of tune that lives in the bones of a family. Molly was already very softly singing along. Hermione, beside Draco at the head of the table, with her hand pressed flat against her belly and her eyes full of light, did not at first notice that her husband had gone very still. She noticed when she turned to him. He was looking at the candle. The match was still in his hand, burned down nearly to his fingers, the small black curl of its dead end forgotten. His face had not done anything dramatic. There was no tear on his cheek. There was no break in his composure. There was only the faintly stunned, faintly disbelieving stillness of a man who had been told a piece of news he had, in some deep, secret part of himself, not actually let himself believe he would be permitted to hear. A girl, his daughter. Hermione reached very quietly and took the spent match out of his fingers and set it down on the linen. Then she took his hand. She lifted it. She laid it in front of every guest in the garden, against the soft, small swell of her belly through the cream silk, and she held it there. He looked down at his hand against her dress. He looked up at her, and then, with a small private smile that was meant for no one but her, the smile she had known for 5 years, and that had, in those 5 years, been seen by perhaps 4 other people in the world, he bent his head and kissed her. It was a soft kiss, a brief one. The kind of kiss a husband gives a wife in front of his mother and her mother, and a great many other people. The kind that is meant to be witnessed, and is also at its centre entirely private. His hand stayed on her belly. Her hand stayed over his hand. The garden, which had begun to talk again in the warm hum of relieved, happy voices, gave them the small courtesy of pretending not to look. When he drew back, his forehead rested against hers for a moment. "A girl," he said, very low. "A girl," she answered. "Granger." "We are going to be all right." "Yes," she said. "I think we are." The afternoon unspooled like a slow gold ribbon. Molly cut the cake, lemon with a thin layer of almond beneath the icing, a compromise she had worked out with her own hands at 4 a.m. and had told no one about. And she served Narcissa the first slice, and Narcissa took it on the small porcelain plate with both hands and said, "Molly, this is the best thing I have eaten in a year." And Molly said, "Oh, hush," and went pink to the roots of her hair. Arthur produced from somewhere about his person a small box wrapped in brown paper, and he gave it to Draco. Inside it was a wristwatch, a muggle one, slightly battered with a leather strap that had been mended once. And Arthur said, "It was my father's, lad, and I thought you might like it for the wee one when she's old enough to tell her about. It tells time the funny way, muggle way. None of the magic, just gears Draco held the watch in his hand and looked at it for a long moment, and then he said, with great care, "Mr. Weasley, I am. Thank you, sir." And Arthur, who had not been called sir by anyone in the last decade and was not certain it suited him, clapped him on the shoulder and said, "Arthur, lad, please, you've been Arthur for years," and went off to find more cake. Narcissa, at some point during the third hour, was discovered in deep conversation with Hannah Abbott about Hannah's herb garden. She was taking notes on the back of an embossed napkin with a quill she had produced from somewhere about her person. Molly, watching from the other side of the table, caught Hermione's eye and very slowly, very deliberately winked. George played 3 more tunes on his fiddle. The quartet, after some initial hesitation, joined him in the third. Luna danced, alone, in the small open space at the foot of the rose walk, her silver dress moving like water in the late light. Teddy Tonks, 8 and serious, asked Hermione with great formality whether the baby would be his cousin. And Hermione, with equal formality, said yes. And Teddy nodded once and said, "Good, I have been wanting a cousin," and went off to inform Andromeda. Ginny, at some point, sat down beside Hermione on the low stone bench at the edge of the rose walk and laid her own hand briefly on Hermione's belly. "A girl," she said. "A girl. Mine's a boy. Harry's already terrified. He should be. I know." They sat for a while in the soft, companionable silence of 2 women who had known each other since they were children and were now, against every prediction the world had once made for either of them, both pregnant in a Malfoy garden in October. "Hermione, your mum would have loved this." Hermione did not answer for a moment. Then she said, very quietly, "I know. She would have. I keep thinking about it. She would have come round on Tuesdays with proper food and bullied you about your iron levels. She'd have knitted too, differently from Mum. Maybe, I don't know, stripes." "Stripes," said Hermione, and gave a small wet laugh. "Definitely stripes." Ginny squeezed her hand. "Mum knows, about all of it, about your parents. She's known since the first Sunday you came to the burrow after the war and couldn't eat. She doesn't try to be her. She wouldn't. But she sort of stands in the place where she'd stand if she could. You know?" "I know." "Good." Ginny stood up, brushed off her dress, looked down at Hermione with the small, fierce expression she'd been giving her since they were 13. "Now, eat some cake. You're feeding too." It was nearly dark when Hermione found herself, briefly, alone on the stone bench. The party had broken into smaller clusters. The candles on the long table had been lit one by one as the light went, and the garden glowed now in a soft constellation of small warm flames. The quartet was playing something slow and sweet. Molly and Arthur were dancing, actually dancing, on the grass, Arthur's hand at the small of his wife's back, both of them laughing. And Narcissa, with great dignity, was being led around the same small patch of grass by her astonished sister Andromeda, who was, by the look of her, having to bite the inside of her cheek to keep from laughing herself. Draco sat down beside Hermione on the bench. He did not say anything for a moment. He only put his arm along the back of the bench behind her shoulders, and he looked, with her, at the small lit garden. "Granger," he said at last. "Yes, I thought of a name, This week, I didn't want to say. Tell me, Cassiopeia. She turned her face to look at him. For my grandmother, he said. Not the one. Not father's mother. The other one. Mother's aunt. She was kind, Granger. She was the only one of them who was. She taught me chess. She used to send me sweets at school that father didn't approve of, and I never knew, until after she died, that mother had asked her to. I thought of her, this week, when you said her. Cassiopeia, Hermione said softly. It's a long name. It is. She might shorten it. Children do. She might. Cassie, perhaps. Cassie. Hermione tasted the name. Cassie Malfoy. Cassie Granger Malfoy, if you'd rather. Cassie. She leaned very slowly until her head came to rest against the warm wool of his shoulder. Cassie. Yes, that's her. He closed his eyes. He sat for a long moment with his cheek against the top of her head, his arm warm around her shoulders. The small lit garden full of the people they loved best in the world, doing things neither of them 5 years ago would have believed possible. Molly was teaching Narcissa a step. Narcissa, against every probability, was learning it. Arthur was laughing. Andromeda was laughing. Teddy Tonks had fallen asleep, very small and very serious, with his cheek on Luna's shoulder. Ginny had her hand in Harry's. George was playing, more softly now, the old lullaby Molly had sung to all her children, and Hannah and Neville were dancing to it. And beyond them, at the edge of the rose walk, Ron and Pansy had, astonishingly, stopped arguing and were standing very close together, looking at nothing in particular. Hermione. I want to say something, and I'm going to say it badly, but I want to say it anyway. Say it. He drew in a breath. She felt it move under her cheek. This morning, he said, before any of this, you said you were frightened of being looked at, of everyone knowing about her, about us. Yes. And I said I would stand next to you. Yes. Granger, I am going to stand next to you for the rest of my life. I am. He stopped, tried again. His voice, when it came, was very low and very careful. The voice he used only at the edge of himself. I am not a man who finds it easy to say things. I think you have noticed. But I want you to know, and I want her to know, when she is old enough to be told things, that I have spent this week being more frightened than I was during the war, and that I have spent it also being happier than I have ever been, and that those two things did not, in the end, cancel each other out. They made each other bigger. Do you know what I mean? I know what you mean. Good. He let out the breath. Because I will not be able to say it twice. She lifted her face from his shoulder. She looked at him in the soft candlelight. The pink of the flame was gone from his hair now, but something else had taken its place. A small, steady light from inside, perhaps. The kind of light that comes into a face only once or twice in a life, and only on the days that decide everything. She kissed him. Not lightly, not briefly. She kissed him the way she had kissed him on the dais in Madame Lavinia's back room, slowly, with the whole of her, and his hand came up to cradle her face, and her hand came up to rest, again, over the front of his coat, over his heart. When she drew back, his forehead came once more to rest against hers. Cassie, she whispered. Cassie, he answered. Behind them, in the small lit garden, Molly Weasley's laugh rang out, bright and warm and entirely unguarded. Narcissa Malfoy, against every prediction the world had ever made for her, laughed too. The candle on the long table, which had burned pink for 3 seconds and gold for the rest of the afternoon, burned steadily on into the soft October dark, and Hermione Granger Malfoy, in her husband's arms on a stone bench at the edge of the Rose Walk, with their daughter the size of a plum sleeping inside her, and 2 grandmothers dancing on the grass, and a quiet life unfolding in front of her like a long warm ribbon, closed her eyes and let herself, at last, believe it. It turned out, in the end, to have been more complicated than the war. It turned out, also, to have been worth every minute. The first snow came in late November, 3 weeks after the party, and Cassiopeia Malfoy, who was, at that point, the approximate size and weight of a small pear and entirely unaware of the weather, chose that morning to move for the first time. Hermione was sitting at the long oak table in the East Wing kitchen, with her hands wrapped around a cup of peppermint tea, watching the snow come down past the leaded glass in slow, soft drifts. Draco was at the stove. He had insisted, sometime in the 2nd month, on learning to make her breakfast himself, and he had, with the same grave competence he brought to everything, become, against all probability, quite good at it. The kitchen smelled of butter and toast, and the faint, dry herb smell of the bowl of rosemary molly had brought round the previous Sunday. It was a small flutter at first, so small that Hermione thought for a second she had imagined it. Then it came again, a soft secret turn somewhere low and deep, like a fish moving once in still water. And she set her teacup down very carefully on the oak. Draco. Draco, come here. He turned. He read her face in 1 second flat. 5 years of marriage had taught him the small rearrangements of it, the way her mouth did the particular thing it was doing now. And he set down the spatula, and he crossed the kitchen, and he knelt, without being asked, on the worn wooden floor beside her chair. "Where?" he said. She took his hand. She laid it, low and flat, where she had felt the small turning. They waited. The snow went on falling past the window in its slow, soft way. The kettle, forgotten, began very faintly to sing. It came again, a small, soft press against his palm. Barely there, barely a thing at all, more the idea of a movement than a movement. And Draco Malfoy, on his knees on the kitchen floor with his cheek pressed against his wife's belly and his hands spread wide across her, closed his eyes and did not, for a long moment, breathe. "Granger, I know. I know. That was her. I know." He did not lift his head for a while. He stayed where he was, his ear pressed against the soft swell of her, his hand spread open beneath her own. She put her fingers in his hair. The morning light through the snow-bright window fell across the kitchen in long, pale bars, and the kettle sang on, ignored, and somewhere upstairs a clock chimed 9 in a slow, contented voice. When at last he lifted his head, his eyes were very bright. "I want to tell them," he said. Both of them. Today." Molly Weasley wept. She wept in her own kitchen, with flour on the cuff of her sleeve and a wooden spoon in her hand, and she set the spoon down very carefully on the rim of the mixing bowl before she came around the table and gathered Hermione into her arms. "Oh, love," she said into Hermione's hair. "Oh, love, already? Isn't she eager? Isn't she the eager one, just like her mother?" She moved against his hand, Molly. He was on the kitchen floor. Oh, he would be. He cried, I think. Not so anyone could see, but I felt it. He had his face against me, and I felt it. Molly drew back. She had Hermione by both shoulders. Her round face was wet, and she was smiling the wide, unguarded smile, and she shook Hermione once, very gently, the way one shakes a small thing one cannot quite believe is real. Hermione, love. Yes, your mum knows. Molly, she does. I don't know how. I don't know the workings of it. I'm not a clever woman about that sort of thing. But I have had 7 of them, love, and I am telling you, she knows, somewhere, in the way that mothers know. Wherever she is in the world today, in that other country, with her other name, she felt that flutter too. I am sure of it. I would stake my life on it. Molly's hands tightened on Hermione's shoulders. Do you hear me? I hear you. Good. Hermione, who could not speak, only nodded. Molly let her go. She turned briskly to the stove, and she busied herself with the kettle in the way she always busied herself when she had said a thing she had meant from the marrow of her bones and needed a moment to recover from having said it. Hermione sat down at the scrubbed table. She put her hand on her belly. After a moment, very quietly, the small, soft turning came again. She did not tell Molly. She kept it, just for herself, that one. Narcissa, when told, did not weep. She set down her teacup. She closed her eyes for the length of 3 slow breaths. Then she opened them, and she said, in the level, even voice she used for the most important things, I am very glad, Draco. Very glad indeed. She crossed the white drawing room. She laid her hand very lightly, for one brief second no longer, against Hermione's cheek. Thank you, my dear, she said. That was all she said. But Hermione, who had learned to read the small, clear language of her mother-in-law over 5 careful years, understood that the thank you was the largest thing Narcissa Malfoy had ever, in her life, given any woman, and she covered Narcissa's hand with her own, briefly, and Narcissa permitted it, and that was, in its own quiet white drawing-room way, the closest thing to an embrace the 2 of them had yet performed. When they left, Hermione turned at the door. Narcissa. Yes, darling. Come to dinner on Sunday, at the Burrow. Molly is doing roast. Narcissa Malfoy, who had not, in her entire life of 53 years, eaten a roast at the Burrow, considered this for the space of 1 heartbeat. At what hour, dear? 1 o'clock. I shall come at 1. Cassiopeia, Lyra, Malfoy was born on a Thursday in April, at 23 minutes past 4 in the morning, in the great curtained bed of the East Wing, with the dawn coming up grey and rose-edged through the leaded glass, and the first blackbird of the morning singing in the garden outside. She was small. She was loud. She had, against every expectation of either parent, a full dark head of her mother's hair, and the long, thin Malfoy hands, and a small considering frown that she wore for the first 10 minutes of her life, as though she had not yet decided whether the world was up to her standards. Draco held her first. The midwife, with great diplomacy, had placed her in his arms before he had quite decided whether he was ready, and he had stood very still with her against his chest for a long moment, his fair head bent over her dark one, his hand spread carefully across the small, impossible weight of her back, and he had said, in a voice no one else in the room could quite hear. "Hello. Hello, you. I've been waiting for you. I have been waiting a very long time." Then he had carried her with great care to Hermione and laid her in her mother's arms. Hermione had looked at her daughter. She had looked at her for a long time. The small, dark head, the frown, the tiny fist already escaped from the blanket, already in the air, already declaring itself. She had bent her face. She had pressed her mouth very lightly to the soft, warm top of Cassiopeia's head, and she had breathed her in, the new-bred smell of a newborn, the impossible particular smell of a person who had not, before this morning, existed in the world. And she had said, against her hair, "Oh, darling. Oh, there you are." Draco sat on the edge of the bed. He put his arm around them both. Outside, in the soft April dawn, the blackbird went on singing, and somewhere in the corridor a clock chimed the half-hour, and the first light came through the curtains and fell across the bed in a long, pale bar, and the three of them sat in it without speaking for a while. Cassiopeia was 3 weeks old the first time both grandmothers held her at once. It was not, strictly speaking, simultaneous. Molly held her first. Molly had been holding babies for 40 years. Molly had a way of folding a small thing into the crook of her elbow that made the small thing immediately stop crying. And Cassiopeia, who had been crying since breakfast, took one outraged look at Molly Weasley's face, considered her for the space of half a second, and went, with great dignity, to sleep. "There," said Molly softly. "There, my love. There, my little one. There." Narcissa, who had been watching from the other end of the sofa with an expression of careful composure, said after a moment, "Molly, how does one do that? The holding, with the arm?" Molly looked up. She did not laugh. She did not, to her enormous credit, even smile. She only nodded very seriously and said, "Come and sit by me, dear. I'll show you. It's all in the elbow. You wouldn't think it, but it is." Narcissa came and sat by her. Hermione, in the doorway with a tray of tea, stopped where she stood. Molly transferred the baby with the unhurried competence of a woman who had done it 1,000 times. She arranged Narcissa's arm. She tucked a small fold of blanket. She positioned Narcissa's hand beneath the warm weight of the small dark head. And Narcissa Malfoy, in dove grey, on the burrow sofa, with her seed pearl cuffs slightly crumpled and her hair coming faintly loose at the temple, looked down into the face of her granddaughter and did not, for a long moment, breathe. "Oh," she said, very low. "Oh, there you are, dear," said Molly. "You've got her. I've got her. You've got her." "Molly." "Yes, dear. She is very small." "They are, dear. They get bigger. You'd be surprised." There was a long, quiet moment in which neither woman spoke. Then Narcissa Malfoy, who in 53 years had never wept in the presence of any woman who was not her own sister, lifted her face to Molly Weasley, and her pale eyes were very bright, and she said, with great difficulty, "Thank you for showing me." And Molly Weasley, who understood at once that "for showing me" was the largest thing it was in Narcissa to say, only put her warm hand over Narcissa's free one, where it rested on the blanket beside the baby, and held it there, and said softly, "You're welcome, dear, any time." In the doorway, Hermione set down the tray of tea very carefully on the side table because her hands had begun to shake, and she crossed the room and she sat down on the rug at her two mothers' feet, and she laid her head against Molly's knee. Molly's free hand came to rest automatically on her hair. Narcissa's free hand, the one Molly had been holding, came to rest after a small, careful moment on Hermione's shoulder. Cassiopeia, in her grandmother's arms, slept on. Years later, when Cassie was 4 and small and dark and fierce, and could already, with great seriousness, recite the names of 7 different kinds of moon roses, because Aunt Narcissa had taught her, and could also, with equal seriousness, knit a row of garter stitch on small wooden needles, because Granny Molly had taught her. Hermione would come into the small drawing room of the East Wing one autumn evening and find her husband on the rug in front of the fire. He would be on his back. Cassie would be sitting on his chest. She would have, in her small fist, a length of cream silk ribbon, the same cream silk ribbon that had arrived in the first envelope from Narcissa on the morning this had all begun. The ribbon Hermione had kept, without quite knowing why, in a drawer of her writing desk for 4.5 years, and she would be tying it with great concentration around her father's wrist. "It's for the wedding," she would inform her mother with great gravity as Hermione sat down on the rug beside them. "Whose wedding, darling?" "Mine. To Daddy. We are getting married." "I see. You can come." "Thank you, my love." "Mummy?" "Yes, darling." "Granny Cissa says the rose is a moon rose because it likes the moon. Granny Molly says it is a moon rose because it is round like the moon. Who is right?" Draco, flat on his back, with a cream silk ribbon being tied very badly around his wrist by his daughter, would catch his wife's eye over the small dark head, and his mouth would do the small reluctant thing, and Hermione would smile back, and she would say, with great seriousness, "They are both right, my love. That is the answer." "Both?" "Both. It happens sometimes." Cassie would consider this. She would nod once, with a small considering frown she'd been wearing since the first 10 minutes of her life, and she would go back to her tying. And Draco, looking up at his wife over the top of his daughter's head, at this woman he had nearly not had, at this life he had nearly not been permitted, at this small, fierce, dark-haired person who was knotting a length of silk ribbon around his wrist, as though it were the most serious work in the world, would reach for Hermione's hand. He would lift it to his mouth. He would press his lips very lightly to the inside of her wrist, to the place where her pulse moved, faint and steady and miraculous, against his lower lip, exactly the way he had pressed them in a kitchen full of candlelight on the night they had agreed to a party they had not wanted and could not have known would give them all of this. He would hold them there for the space of 3 slow breaths. And Hermione Granger Malfoy, on the rug in front of the fire, in the east wing of Malfoy Manor, with her daughter on her husband's chest and a cream silk ribbon tying them in some small private way to a morning 4.5 years gone, would close her eyes and let herself once more believe it. It had been more complicated than the war. It had been, in every way that mattered, worth it.
Thank you for staying with me to the end. I wrote this story because I wanted to know what happened after the great battles are over, after the ones are put away, after the headlines have moved on, and the heroes have gone home, and the world has somehow kept turning. What does love look like then? Not the love of grand gestures and last stands, but the quieter love, the love that survives a Tuesday morning, the love that holds a sonogram in its hand at 1 in the morning and does not know what to say, the law that sits on a kitchen floor with its ear against a small swell of barley and waits very patiently for a single flutter. That law, I think, is the hardest one to write. It does not have the drama of war, it has only the slow accumulation of small choices, a hand offered across a table, a scone eaten when one did not want it, a silk ribbon kept in a drawer for 4.5 years for no reason one could name. I wanted to give Draco and Hermione that love. I wanted to give them mothers who tried in their imperfect ways. Thank you for listening. If this story warmed something in you, if it made you smile or age or remember someone you loved, please leave a comment below. It means more than you know. Sleep well, be gentle with yourself. Until next story.